Well, welcome back. We're now ready to hear from our third panel, which will address pilot training solutions. Dr. Dunks will be the technical panel lead and will introduce our panelists. Dr. Dunks.
Thank you, Member Weiner. As a reminder for this panel, push the button on the microphone. A red light will indicate that the microphone is on. And when speaking, of course, bring your microphone close to you, and when finished, turn off the mic. So as Member Weiner mentioned, this panel will examine pilot training solutions. And something very appropriate just happened here during our break. We had a logbook signed, a pilot logbook signed. So I think that's a great introduction to this panel. Our panelists today are Rich Stowell, Master Aerobatic Instructor with the Society of Aviation and Flight Educators, or SAFE. Thomas Turner, the Executive Director of the American Bonanza Society Air Safety Foundation. David Oord, the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs with the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, or AOPA. And Stasi Poulos, President of Mindstar Aviation. Our first panelist will be Rich Stowell. Mr. Stowell.
Thank you. The status quo in aviation education is unacceptable. Those of us who provide spin and upset recovery training see the results of our training system on a daily basis. We constantly deal with the same recurring questions and concerns, the same fears and frustrations. Member Weiner has referred to loss of control as a stubbornly recurrent safety challenge. Recurrent indeed. In 1944, Wolfgang Langewiesche observed that almost all fatal flying accidents are caused by loss of control during a turn. He concluded that pilots, as a group, simply don't know how to turn. Little has changed in the 70-plus years since. Most fatal loss of control accidents continue to occur during the maneuvering phase. In fact, if we separated the block of maneuvering accidents into its own category, loss of control while maneuvering by itself would rank third on the list of fatal accident causes. It's clear that except for the ability to mimic only the most basic of turns, pilots as a group remain unconsciously incompetent with regard to maneuvering flight. According to aviation safety pioneer Jerome Lederer, every accident, no matter how minor, is a failure of the organization. In this case, the organization is our flight training industry. These pilots entrusted us with their safety and well-being. They believed the training system would teach them how to maneuver an airplane, and we failed them. Simply stated, we have a training delivery problem. We can try to push all of the doctrine and standards and curricula and technology and products we want into the training pipeline. Absent a concerted effort to significantly improve the delivery system, none of these enhancements will yield the safety dividends we envision. Responding to the loss of control problem in commercial aviation, the International Civil Aviation Organization recently published its manual on upset prevention and recovery training. The manual promotes an integrated training approach to training designed to maximize the learning experience. Academics, laying a strong and factually accurate foundation of aeronautical knowledge. Simulation, which can be as sophisticated as a level D flight simulator, or as simple as visualization techniques similar to those used by airshow pilots before they fly their aerobatic routines. And on-airplane training, the live experience that cements the concepts and techniques introduced through academics and simulation into a positive and enduring learning experience. This is the way flight training could and should be conducted at all levels. And it is the way flight training began a century ago. The Wright brothers established the first flight schools in the US. Guess what their training methodology was? Detailed ground school, simulation using a functioning mock-up of their flyer, and on-airplane training. Moreover, the Wrights trained their students to be demonstration pilots. What if you trained your students to be demo pilots for your flight school, for your airplanes? How about for general aviation? What if our mindset was, you represent me, you represent our school, you represent general aviation? Somewhere between the rights and the new ICAO manual, we got lost. We've deviated from a proven flight plan. Perhaps we've forgotten where we were trying to go in the first place. The ICAO manual serves as a reminder, a course correction, a path back to what the Wright brothers understood, that acting in the best interests of our students also serves our interests. But recalibrating won't be easy. According to AOPA, educational quality and customer service make up 75% of a pilot's training experience. Of all the obstacles on the path to the private pilot check ride, AOPA found the quality of the instruction to be a persistent issue and a weak link in the chain. Students will put up a lot to become private pilots. What most won't tolerate, however, is poor treatment and poor instruction. So they eventually quit. Yet a minority does reach the next level. Increasingly unfulfilled and unconfident, some of them eventually drop out of aviation as well. Others are destined to become accident stats discussed at forums like this. But we're talking about real people. People who at one time were inspired by flight, who were excited about joining the aviation community. The status quo underappreciates and undervalues the profession of aviation education. As a result, poorly managed schools and poorly trained instructors are the norm. In contrast, when instructors accept the challenge of professional development and are recognized for achievement, the marketplace responds in a positive way. The majority of master instructors, for example, earn 10 to 40% more income as a result of participation in the Master Instructor Continuing Education Program. And since 1997, 3 out of 4 honorees in the National CFI and Fast Team Rep of the Year categories have been master instructors. The general aviation fleet is enormously diverse. Not everyone will use a supplemental angle of attack system. Not everyone will take advantage of new technologies and training products. But at some point, everyone will interact with a flight school or an instructor. And everyone needs to learn to turn. So imagine what general aviation would look like if authentic flight school operators were the norm, where most schools focused on developing long-term participants in aviation and not on the Hobbs meter. If authentic instructors were the norm, where most of those who became flight instructors did so because they were passionate about teaching, not because they were incentivized into it as a means to log hours for something else. Where the spin endorsement provided a legitimate record of an instructor's stall spin knowledge and capability. Where instructors taught to the student, not to the test. Creating a culture of authentic operators and instructors will be a difficult task, but it is imperative if training solutions will have any hope of large-scale success. Lastly, if pilots were taught properly about turn dynamics, conceptually simple, this will not necessarily be an easy task. To get the ball rolling, today I'm announcing the Learn to Turn initiative. I envision a freely available multimedia experience that goes far beyond our historically inadequate treatment of turns. But I can't do this alone. I need your help. If you can offer time, talent, or other resources to this project, then let's work together to teach pilots how to maneuver their airplanes safely and with confidence. Imagine the potential dividends resulting from these training solutions. Most students would become private pilots instead of dropping out. Most pilots, including instructors, would invest in recurrent training. The successful outcome of a maneuver genuinely would never be in doubt, and loss of control no longer would be the primary cause of fatal accidents. We often think of the Wright brothers' achievement in terms of powered flight. but the Wrights saw control as the central problem they had to solve in order for flying machines to be viable. Controllable flight is their legacy, and their vision forever changed the world. I'm not proposing that we change the world, only that we change critical parts of our training delivery system. The mandate we have as aviation educators is captured in Richard Bach's short story, School for Perfection. To teach, to take time with the students, to offer them the precious gift that is the ability to fly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stowell. Our next presenter is Mr. Thomas Turner of the American Bonanza Society Air Safety Foundation. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Member Wayner, Dr. Dunks, Mr. Cox, members of the Loss of Control Forum, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this forum. I've been asked to discuss the role of aircraft type clubs and transition training in preventing loss of control in flight and loss of control scenarios in instrument meteorological conditions. A type club represents owners and operators of a specific aircraft type or family of aircraft. Type clubs usually emphasize technical support and information sharing, flying safety, and social activities. Some type clubs, like the American Bonanza Society, the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association's Copa University, and Lancer Owners and Builders Organization, and others, also provide pilot training, flight instructor training, and even mechanic training on aircraft type-specific operations and maintenance. The Type Club Coalition, sponsored by the Experimental Aircraft Association, is an organization of over 35 owners groups. Coalition members share type-specific pilot training best practices to address known accident causes such as loss of control in flight. As such, the TCC is a valuable conduit for getting the results of this and similar forums to a wide range of airplane owners and operators. One product of the TCC was a response in 2012 to a request from the GAJSC for documented best practices for teaching missed approach and balked landing procedures, specifically to avoid loss of control events. Aircraft accident investigator Jeff Edwards has found a positive correlation between Type Club membership and reduced accident rates. Edwards found that American Bonanza Society members were 2.5 times less likely to have a serious accident and 11 times less likely than non-members to be involved in a fatal accident. He found similar results for other airplane types. Edwards acknowledges that it's not known whether type clubs make safer pilots or if safer pilots tend to join type clubs. Focus groups told him that it's probably a combination of the two. Regardless, type clubs fill a vital role in communicating safety information to pilots. There are a number of challenges to making a positive change in the loss of control in flight accident rate. The first is to define loss of control in the first place. The GAJSC has a long and frankly somewhat confusing official definition of loss of control in flight. It covers a lot of territory. But the definition perhaps is so all-inclusive that it does not translate well into what the CFI in the field needs to know to present to a student or during a flight review. Data suggests that the overwhelming majority of loss of control events involve stalls. This and the push for airplane owners to install angle of attack indicators strongly suggests to me that we should stop talking about loss of control in flight and use the much better focused word stall when addressing this threat and mitigations to our students. A second challenge is teaching the use of angle of attack indicators. There is no standard for the presentation or placement of angle of attack information. Individual installations are subject to calibration by pilots who are not trained in the precision flying necessary to assure accuracy. Some pilots report customizing the calibration to different parameters. All this means that when writing about or teaching angle of attack indicator use, there is no guarantee that one airplane's indicator will appear or be used in the same way as any other airplanes. Even pilots well trained in AOA use may find their habits do not transfer directly to flying another AOA-equipped airplane. The best information I have so far is about 4,000 angle of attack indicators have been built for light general aviation airplanes so far. Assuming they are all installed in piston-powered GA airplanes, this amounts to about 2% of the fleet. We can and should recommend angle of attack indicator installation, but 98% of the fleet does not have one. And without a federal mandate, most owners will probably not install such a device. Further, although most stall-related crashes and all spins involve uncoordinated flight controls, angle of attack indicators are only calibrated for rudder-coordinated flight. We must still address traditional means of angle of attack awareness, rudder coordination, and stall avoidance, recognition, and recovery as the primary means of reducing the rate of deadly stalls. There's no way around it. We need to teach the basics of stick and rudder flying in all transition and recurrent training. Type clubs have the tribal knowledge to incorporate these and many other skills into type-specific guidance for transition and recurrent training for the airplanes they support. Advisory Circular 90-109A provides a good starting point for the creation of type-specific guides for those clubs that do not already have them. Let's shift gears now and talk about two loss of control scenarios in instrument meteorological conditions. First, we'll consider the loss of primary attitude information, partial panel flight. A 2002 study by the FAA and AOPA's Air Safety Foundation put instrument-rated pilots in airplanes specially modified so an instructor could disable the pump that powers the attitude gyroscope. During a missed approach, the instructor disabled the pump, timed from that point to the pilot's first verbal indication of a problem, and evaluated the pilot's ability to control the aircraft. The results? The average recognition time ranged from 2.6 minutes with instrument warning flags to 7.3 minutes without warnings. When loss of control occurred, it was during the recognition phase, before the pilot had determined an instrument had failed and identified which. We are pretty good at flying by partial panel once we have identified a failed instrument, but having a CFI reach over and cover your attitude indicator does not teach the essential skills of recognizing a discrepancy, diagnosing the nature of the failure, and controlling the airplane throughout the entire process. A benefit of glass cockpit displays is that almost every condition that results in a loss of primary attitude information immediately results in a red X indication on the primary flight display. Recognition and diagnosis are done immediately and obviously for the pilot. In either system, however, the only way to experience this before you face a real-world failure in IMC is to practice instrument failure recognition, diagnosis, and control in a flight training device or simulator. Type clubs and the entire instructional community need to work to add simulation as a standard part of initial instrument training, transition training, and instrument procedures checks. Now let's discuss another loss of control in IMC scenario, the missed approach. A major role for type clubs is to teach the specific combinations of power, attitude, and airplane configuration that permit low workload flight, and to ensure that training includes an emphasis on preparing for and practicing missed approach procedures. As an example, we'll very quickly cover the facts of a specific loss of control event that occurred during a missed approach. The pilot of a Baron 58 was cleared for a localizer back course 3-1 approach in IMC. Almost immediately after beginning a missed approach, he reported seeing the runway and requested clearance to circle to land, although he was below circling minimums. He was denied the clearance, so the pilot resumed flying the missed procedure, but not before telling the tower he'd like to try the RNAV GPS 36 approach next. Tower relayed this to center, and when the Baron pilot was handed off, the controller immediately gave the pilot instructions to begin the GPS 3-1 approach. The pilot acknowledged, but soon lost control of the aircraft. NTSB investigators did an excellent job of uncovering the facts of this crash. What's not in the probable cause report, however, may provide the most useful information to prevent repeats of this tragedy. Although local television is hardly the definitive source of aviation information, televised interviews added important details that are not mentioned in the NTSB report. The pilot owned an A-36 Bonanza, but had borrowed the Baron for the flight because the weather was IMC, and as he had told the Baron's owner, it's safer to fly a twin in IFR. The Baron was equipped with a full Garmin GPS panel. The pilot's Bonanza did not have a GPS. I can imagine the pilot, unfamiliar with the GPS, getting further and further behind the airplane as he began the missed approach, loaded the approach he thought he was going to get, and then reloaded the approach he'd been unexpectedly assigned. I submit that the pilot and his family would have been much safer flying his non-GPS single-engine A-36, given the pilot's experience. The difference was not experience with the airplane, but experience with its panel. Type clubs have the opportunity and the responsibility to communicate the results of NTSB investigations to their members and translate them into type-specific lessons aimed at avoiding repeats of accident history. At ABS, we combined the NTS report of this bearing crash with the local knowledge we learned into 5 standard operating procedures for avoiding loss of control during a missed approach. We published this in an article read by our 9,100 members and our accredited flight instructor staff, so we can all learn from this tragic event. This illustrates the vital importance of type clubs as information portals and active teachers of techniques that will save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Our next panelist will be David Oord of AOPA. Mr. Oord.
Good afternoon, Member Weiner, Dr. Dunks, Mr. Cox, members of the forum. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak about this. We've talked a lot about risk management here and the need to incorporate it into both the training and certification of pilots. I'm here to talk about just that very thing. I did have the privilege of co-chairing the loss control working group under the restructured GAJSC. And again, it's important to note that that was a data-driven process, and the safety enhancements that were approved and developed under that process really represent a plan that has the highest potential for preventing loss of control events. I would encourage that we continue on that plan and fully implement all of the safety enhancements within it. But essentially, the working group, through its analysis, recognized that we need to come up with strategies to better manage risk. Being the Pilot Training Solutions panel, there are 2 things that I really want to talk about. But some of the safety enhancements, obviously angle of attack we've talked about, the need for improved aeronautical decision-making, the need for transition training, and again, these are all safety enhancements that were developed and approved under the working group. Transition training, if you're going up, down, sideways, regardless, if it's a different aircraft for you, you need to have structured transition training using maybe a type club and or an instructor that's familiar with that aircraft. The risk-based flight review I'll talk about, reduction in regulatory roadblocks. How do we see what's happening in the experimental fleet that Mr. Elliott talked about and get those technological solutions into type certificated aircraft? That's something that we at AOPA feel very strongly about, and we're seeing some movement coming out of the FAA aircraft certification offices. Most recently, the electrical driven attitude indicator policy that came out. Airman certification standards I will talk about, and then obviously we also talked about the Stowell response, or pilot response to unexpected events. That in and of itself is a safety enhancement that is under the working group. But again, I wanted to talk about 2 specific things, the risk-based flight review and airman certification standards, being that this is the pilot training panel. What those 2 safety enhancements, in my opinion, represent is a 2-pronged approach. So we have the pilot population, and how do we reach what's been said, how do we reach the unreachable? How do we reach the entire pilot population to incorporate risk-based decision and safety risk management? So we have the new pilots that will get their new initial certificate, and obviously ones that will go on to additional certificates and or ratings. But we have that white space, and that white space is the flight review. That's the only mandatory touch that a pilot has once certificated, and it's the only opportunity for us to really evaluate the skills, knowledge, and risk management. So we have a safety enhancement specifically devoted for a risk-based flight review. The working group, through its analysis, thought it was important to push out that information that we identified through that process to the flight instructor community, members of SAFE, members of NAFI, both of which were part of this process, both of which are part of the GAJSC and going forward, but really recognize the national trends, but also regional specific risks. And then those flight instructor communities would be needed to provide feedback to close the loop, to say, okay, what are you seeing out in the field? What are you seeing in your local area? Maybe there was an airspace redesign. Maybe it's a geographic limitation, but really understand what is your local risk and impart that to the local flight community. So the working group, the GAJSC, is working to hopefully make the flight review an opportunity for both education and evaluation that will be relevant and meaningful to both the pilot's location and the type of flying that they do. It's important that we don't standardize, in my opinion, the flight review, but we really tailor it, working with the instructor and working with the pilot and whatever aircraft they fly, the type of flying they do, to really understand what are the risks and what are they maybe deficient in, and really improve their proficiency in there. So that's the existing pilot population and one avenue, one strategy to reach them. The second one, which the working group felt strongly about, was the incorporation of airman certification standards and introduce risk-based decision-making at the earliest point practical in airman testing. And you got to integrate that into the training, the knowledge test, and the practical test, and then obviously the training programs. And create a system in which the FAA and industry review and revise the standards as necessary through a structured process. Which leads me to the Airman Certification System Working Group. That we developed Airman Certification Standards, which are essentially an enhanced version of the PTS. It adds specific knowledge and risk management elements to each practical test standard, area of operation, and task. I would like to note, though, that the working group, which is currently ongoing and under the Aviation Rulemaking Advisory Committee, is the third phase of a multi-year, multi-phase project, which has been industry-led, but has every department and line of business under FAA flight standards. It really represents a partnership between both industry and the FAA to improve airman certification and improve the process and make it relevant and meaningful. But what was first discovered by the ARC was that we have the practical test standard, which was a very good document and clearly spelled out what are the skills needed in order for a pilot to understand and be able to demonstrate for the practical test, but there was no knowledge test standard, and that lack of knowledge test standard resulting in test questions that were out of date. We had to train and teach pilots how to fly NDB, ADF approaches, knowing that they probably would never have to fly one, and they would probably fly an RNAV approach. Overly complex test questions that had multiple charts, multiple interpolations, which got you answers which were within a couple of knots from each other. Irrelevant test questions like the height of blowing sand. Not sure how that adds to aviation safety, but it was a test question. But ultimately, it created a test that was disconnected from real skills, technology, and knowledge required for safe operation. What that led to was pilots recognizing that this is just an arbitrary hurdle to get over, so you might as well just go ahead and memorize a bunch of answers to test questions, and get it out of the way. So the Airman Certification Standards and the working groups that have subsequently been stood up, many of the members of the working group are here in the audience and have developed Airman Certification Standards. So here's an example specifically on slow flight and stalls, more relevant to this operation. So this would be familiar. This is pretty much taken directly from the practical test standards, and it clearly defines, and sorry, it's a little small, but slow flight and stalls, what is the task, where are the references, so where would you go to find out more information, and then the objective, to determine that the applicant has the satisfactory knowledge, skills, and risk management associated with maneuvering during slow flight. And then it clearly defines the skills that the applicant is expected to be able to demonstrate the ability to. And I would like to note that, yes, the previous version of the PTS does not reference angle of attack. This one does in multiple places, because now we add the knowledge elements that the applicant demonstrates an understanding of, and then it clearly lists exactly what they have to understand going forward. Most importantly, for every single area of operation and task, we now add the risk management element so that the applicant demonstrates the ability to identify, assess, and mitigate the risks encompassing, and it clearly defines what they need to know. Again, not only what they need to know, but now why they need to know it. So the draft standards have been developed, and they are currently under the FAA review. Test banks are being revised for accuracy, and those three systems, the standards, the test banks, and the guidance handbooks are really the three components of what we like to call the Airman Certification System. Every test question that's currently in the test bank is being reviewed by a FAA panel that has one industry participant from the University of North Dakota that is going line by line, question by question, determining that these questions are relevant and meaningful. More importantly, they're adding a code to those questions, a 4-digit code, so that if the student gets a question wrong, they can then go back into the standard and go to his or her instructor and say, this is what I was deficient in. I need to know how to better understand this, and then it will be followed up by the evaluator, the designated pilot examiner, on the check ride to ensure that they now comprehend and understand what they did not know. All 3 components are critical. Guidance handbooks as well. I forgot to mention that part of this process, we are developing an entire chapter specifically on loss control, upset prevention recovery training. That chapter will be in the new updated version for the airplane flying handbook. It's been under multiple reviews, multiple draft forms. Many of the people in the audience here have reviewed that, and it's going through that process to ensure that it's right. We have to get that right, and we're committed to do it and get that information out. Alternatively, we also have a new chapter on medications and the I'm Safe. We specifically call out diphenhydramine in the new updated version for the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. So all those 3 components of the system are being developed. We are prototyping the standards. We did not want to just send this out without making sure it's right. We started last summer down at Embry-Riddle with a private pilot standard. We expanded that to Part 61 and 141 training, and now have expanded that to the IFR rating in both Seattle and Florida. Targeted implementation for the private, commercial, and IFR new airman certification standard is mid-2016, and we are on track to recognize that goal. I will say in summary, though, once fully implemented, I am hopeful that these new standards, in addition to the risk-based flight review, will make training and testing more relevant and meaningful. But ultimately, it's all about preventing the future accident, and I'm hopeful that those 2 strategies will be one component to do so, not just loss control accidents, but all accidents. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Oord. Our final panelist for this session is Stasi Poulos from Mindstar Aviation. Mr. Poulos.
Thank you, Dr. Dunks, and thank you, Member Weiner and Mr. Cox, and thank you to the NTSB for holding this event. This is a very interesting information. As Dr. Dunks mentioned, I'm Stasi Poulos. I'm the president of Mindstar Aviation. I'll very quickly go through what Mindstar is so that you can understand the relevance to this topic area and why we're so passionate about this. Mindstar consists of a number of different companies. It started as a multimedia company. We also have Mindstar Aviation, which develops avionics and systems simulations for flight simulators. Mindstar Global Solutions sells those solutions to the government and to some of the intelligence communities in the DC area. Mindstar Community is a training organization and a community built around pilots and students who are interested in learning more about aviation. And then finally, our Real Nav Data company creates navigation data with a industry partner for distribution of real-world navigation data into those simulations of GPS units that we create. Without going into great detail about each of the systems, we simulate some pretty complex systems in general aviation aircraft. Each of those systems, in many cases, has GPS integrated into it, so we roll that Real Nav Data product into that so that people can actually train with the real-world environment that they're used to in their particular airport. And we find that really, really important, and we find that the customers really, really need this because they want to train for a particular test or a particular approach that they're going to fly. And I'll get into that particular approach in more detail here in a minute. One of the partners that we developed avionics for is the Redbird line of simulators. Pictured on the screen is an AATD, or Advanced Aviation Training Device, in this case of a King Air 350. If you look at that in a lot of detail, you'll notice this is not what people would typically expect for an AATD. People are used to an AATD, in some cases, being a smaller unit, but the world is changing. The world has become now, with technology and the availability of lower cost equipment, to be able to build a simulator that is much more realistic. And you look at something like this and you climb into this environment and this kind of simulator, you can now become very much engrossed in the operations of the aircraft. And that is really important for getting yourself and into the suspension of disbelief that you're in a simulator. And I'm going to borrow that from Rich and from our friends in California who use that term, that Put yourself there. Be in that simulator and be in the real world in your mind, because it's really important to get the simulator to be a fundamental part of the training. I want to talk just for a minute about, as software developers and software vendors, we're not just the software people, we're actually the customers as well. We actually have 4 flight schools at our airport here in Leesburg, Virginia. Some Part 61, some Part 141. One of them is even a 135 operator. But at that one airport, we have 3 Redbird AATDs and 1 BATD, the Basic Aviation Training Device. And the reason I bring that up is because we've taken a lot of time to work with the schools to teach them how to better use the simulator for this kind of training. And it's for basic training for the primary certificate and for instrument training and beyond. And our emphasis is you need to look beyond the loggable limits for VFR and IFR for what you can use a simulator for. There seems to be a consistent emphasis on, well, I can only log this much time, so that's the extent of how much I'm going to use the simulator. We believe this is a complete ignoring of the value of simulation. You need to be able to do what's necessary to get a student or a candidate for an advanced rating to the place where they need to be in a faster way and in a more economical way and in a more time-effective way. So one of my important things that I want to get across is this emphasis on loggable limits needs to be reduced in importance, and we need to look at what's best for the students. At our airport, we've done a number of things with the flight schools, and going back one, we own one of those Redbirds at the airport. And we have not only developed the software in it, but we teach people how to use that simulator better. So, like the Hair Club for Men, we're not just vendors, we're customers too. But in doing that, we found some things, both with primary training and for instrument training. First thing is you will inevitably have somebody say that the simulator, well, it doesn't feel like a real airplane. Does that matter? In some cases, yes, but I would like to suggest that it directs your attention to some things in the aircraft, in the simulation, that you should be paying attention to despite what it feels like. And I'm going to give you 2 examples up there and one additional one. The first one is a loss of control on short final that I have seen happen over and over again in the simulator. And this is a full motion Redbird FMX simulator. And the student is feeling some movement. The movement is intended to distract. It's intended to take their mind away from some of the things they're focusing on the instrument panel and give some extra sensations. But consistently, I see students who will land short, or they'll lose control on short final. And they'll wonder, they'll even ask the question, why are the wings wobbling like this? This thing isn't flying right. And you look down at the airspeed indicator and you see 50 knots come and go. And then you see 40 knots come and go. This is a fundamental aspect of flying. And as Rich will tell you in his earlier presentation, stalls are not just about airspeed, but it is a component and it is an indicator. How people are in simulators and they're not even paying attention to the airspeed is a fundamental question we need to answer. Why is this happening? The excuse we consistently hear is that, oh, well, it's the simulator, so it doesn't feel right. My argument is, if you can fly the simulator well, you can fly the airplane really well. My second example is from Oshkosh AirVenture just this past year. One of the scenarios we had created for the EAA Pilot Proficiency Clinic was a 172 landing on an aircraft carrier. Unrealistic in its actual practice, but it created a situation where somebody was in an unfamiliar situation. You see that aircraft carrier out there, you're trying to land on a very short runway, so it's about airspeed control and managing your direction of flight. And consistently, again, we saw the same thing as we saw in example 1, that pilots would frequently lose sight of their airspeed, lose sight of their rate of descent, and these conditions mirror what we've seen in the statistics for real-world loss of control accidents. So the argument that it's a simulator and doesn't feel right does not hold water because we see the same situations in both types of environments. The third example I want to talk about is and this is for me personally, whenever I go on a flight, on a real-world flight, I will climb into the simulator and pre-fly that flight. I want to know what things are going to look like before I get there. I can look at a sectional chart and tell you that I see some colors here that tell me there's rising terrain, but it's a completely different situation when you get into the simulator and you see the mountain in front of you. So my argument again is whether it feels like a real airplane, there is very big advantages to learning what's going on in the simulator. I'll very quickly talk about, we've also implemented that the instrument students at our airport will initially start with their first 10 hours in the simulator, and that's before they get to the airplane at all, and that's regardless of whether it's loggable or not. We hope these numbers will ultimately change, go back up to 20, but it is really important. We also have implemented the pre-solo solo for students, where we will solo the student in the simulator. The instructor will get out and simulate the solo before they actually fly for the real solo flight. We see that find various things that could be going wrong that can be corrected before somebody gets in the real airplane. In order to test this environment, we had created something called the Shenandoah sortie. This was a VFR into IMC loss of control scenario we developed along with SAFE, and we used this to decide and find out, would the pilot turn around in time as deteriorating conditions were encountered? Would the pilot contact ATC for help? Would the pilot confess their situation? We created an environment where people could actually talk to ATC in the simulator and call for help if they had these situations happen. And would they be prepared for the accident chain? Because what they didn't know is we had additional failures if they failed to turn around. And what we found is, and I'm jumping ahead because I see my time is going forward very quickly. What we found is that 80% of the pilots, and these weren't just students, these were all ranges of pilots, failed to turn around early in the flight, even as conditions deteriorated. Fewer than 30% called for help on the radio and confessed their situation. We found a complete resistance by VFR pilots to actually use the radio, which we can talk in great detail if we wanted to. Pilots were definitely not prepared for the secondary failure, and we did find that some actually admitted that in the simulator they followed roads that they knew existed to find the airport that was at the end of their mission. This is not the way we should be training. And we should be getting people to recognize these problems in the simulators long before they get into the real airplane. That concludes my time and my presentation. Thank you, NTSB, for our time here.
Thank you, Mr. Poulos. So to start this questioning session off, I'd like to pose a question to Mr. Stowell, and the others can come in. If I'm a new student or someone that initiated flight training and then stepped away from it, or I'm a certified pilot that would like to get additional training because I feel like my initial training wasn't quite up to the standards that it should be, where can I go to find resources available to locate effective flight schools, or how do I know that I'm getting good training?
Very good question, and a couple of different resources that people might be interested in looking into depending on the type of training. If it's an advanced training like a tailwheel endorsement or perhaps even some upset or spin training, one resource is the International Aerobatic Club, IAC.org. They have a How to Begin menu tab, and under that tab there's a directory of aerobatic schools. So they've become sort of a clearinghouse for that type of information, although there's no vetting that's done, so whoever is shopping for the training has to do their due diligence. There is a, it follows an advisory circular that I helped put together that provides guidance on how to shop for spin training, upset recovery training, and aerobatics. That's available on the SAFE website in the Public Resource Center as well. So it can help a prospective student at least be forearmed and forewarned when they're asking questions of the particular flight school. Other resources as well, talk to other pilots about their experience. I think I think maybe we underestimate the value of word of mouth, and it can be very effective because pilots, when they're asked to evaluate instruction they've received or experiences they've had, by and large will be pretty straightforward and honest about it. So also you can sort of tell perhaps a little bit by the feel of the flight school, maybe that gut instinct when you walk in. Are people friendly? Are they willing to take some time and spend with you and talk about it? Or is it does it feel like a McDonald's mass production type of thing? So those are a couple of different kinds of things that people can do to be more proactive and not just go in and assume, well, this is a flight school, you're an instructor, you must be at this particular level of expertise.
And to add to that, certainly if someone is new to flying and is looking for an expert instructor, there are resources, the SAFE website, safepilots.org, the NAFI website, nafinet.org. Type-specific training is available in a lot of cases. Obviously, in our case, American Bonanza Society, we've been teaching the Beechcraft Pilot Proficiency Program for over 30 years. Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association, Rick Beach there, they are unveiling a brand new revamped, what they're calling COPA University, to add a lot of decision-making training as well. So in addition to the general flight instruction question, where do I find a good instructor? Like Rich said, there are a lot of resources locally, and then nationally there are resources both in general instruction or specific areas of instruction, and then in addition to that, type-specific training as well. I'd suggest going to the EAA website, eaa.org/type club, and find some representatives of the type of aircraft that you are going to be flying or you might be buying if you're buying one, and see if that's available.
And I wanted to follow upon that. AOPA, obviously, we lose a lot of pilots every year. We lose, on average, 6,000 private pilots a year. These are certificated pilots, and they leave for whatever reason. I mean, it's costly to maintain proficiency. Kids, family, work gets in the way. So there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pilots that are sitting on the sidelines right now that could get back into aviation. And it's how do we get those folks back in? So we have stood up a program under AOPA called the Rusty Pilots Program. We have seminars at every one of our fly-ins. We go out to the communities, out to the pilots where they are to do this seminar, and it qualifies as the hour of ground school for your flight review once completed. Widely popular at every one of our fly-ins. In addition to that, we really feel strongly that that in addition to type clubs, but flying clubs. I mean, every airport will probably have a flying club that a pilot can get back into, because ultimately this is a social activity, it's a recreational activity, and that's really the glue, and that's how you change culture, is you talk to local pilots, you talk to the flying club, hey, do you have a good instructor? And if they do, they'll be able to point you in the right direction. So with those two strategies that under AOPA's banner, we really feel like that's a good way to get people back into the fold.
I'd like to add to that flying and learning to fly is inherently a very social activity. So because of its social nature, the internet is one of those places where you can do a lot of research on what kind of flight school you're involving yourself with. And I'll give you a perfect example of, I'm a member of a group of simulator professionals, and we talk about various things that's wrong with flight training. And we came across a comment from a flight instructor, and I'm going to paraphrase this, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is what students should know to look for to avoid. And it's this statement: a CFI should always think of their logbook and flight time first. That is not about education. And Rich and I talked about this morning, this very topic, that we have built a system that is incentivizing people to be involved in flight training for all the wrong reasons. And we need to find a way to make this about education again, about bringing people to aviation, bringing people to learning about the technology, learning about flying, not about only time building. Now, this is an anomaly. There are a lot of very good flight instructors out there, but it only takes one or two in a region to poison the entire environment. we need to be on the lookout for this, and we need to help warn the students of what they're looking for. When they show up at the flight school, they don't even know yet what are the pitfalls of flight training. And we need to find a way to more successfully guide the students before they even get to the flight school.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Turner. For those manufacturers that are still producing general aviation aircraft, what is the relationship between type clubs and aircraft manufacturers? And as an airplane owner, do I need both? Should I be involved with both the manufacturer and the type club?
Well, I can speak directly to our relationship with Textron Aviation, which owns Beechcraft. I meet very regularly with the senior leadership team of Textron Aviation, and Textron has begun starting its own pilot training company that does what's called entitlement training. When you buy a new Bonanza or a King Air or a Citation jet, in the past, the Cessna and Beechcraft have contracted with an independent company, but now they're doing it in-house in Textron. Where that's important to me in the Bonanza Baron world is that Textron Aviation has come to us, to our program, and is using our Flight Instructor Academy and Instructor Standardization Program to accredit its instructors. So we have a very good working relationship ourselves with the aircraft manufacturer. And other groups, the Cessna Pilots Association is working with the Cessna Pilots side of the house at Textron. I don't know to what extent they're doing, not as much as we are, I know that. The Twin Cessna organization, which supports the older, larger Cessna piston twins, is working with them as well. So at least Textron is reaching out to the type clubs for our expertise. We also support the technical side of the house, the maintenance side of the house for the legacy airplanes, the ones that are not in current production, but that's a little outside of the scope of this question. I know also, as I mentioned, Cirrus is working very actively. The Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association has a very close relationship with Cirrus, and they're working very closely with them. They have a standardization program. Other companies, maybe not quite so much to that level, but there are also airplanes that in many cases are they were produced in much smaller numbers, and so they don't have the support network that we do. They don't have the full-time staff like we have in some of the other organizations. But for most of the current production airplanes, it appears that the manufacturers are really looking to the owners community and the type clubs to be a partner in the pilot training effort. And we're fortunate that we're part of that ourselves.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Mr. Stowell. In your presentation, you talked about this issue of pilots not knowing how to turn, which is the fundamental flying skill. And you mentioned this Learn to Turn initiative. And I'd just like to get more information on that, what your thoughts are and how this could help the aviation community in learning to turn.
Sure. Fundamentally, we've been teaching turns the same way as, for decades and decades going back to stick and rudder. And we tend to just kind of keep repeating the same things without really getting down to the basics in terms of pilots' lack of understanding, a general lack of understanding of what the controls actually do and what the secondary effects of those controls are on other things that go on in the airplane. Over the years, I've conducted surveys of pilots, all different levels, and about 900 pilots so far. And if you ask them, well, what are you actually doing during the turn? What is making that happen? 25% of them will say the rudder is making the airplane turn. And yet, in the airplane flying handbook, it's very clear, at least in 2 places, it says very specifically the rudder doesn't turn the airplane. And so if 1 out of 4 pilots will say the rudder turns the airplane, it's no wonder that loss of control while maneuvering is the top reason for fatal accidents, because the pilot is miscommunicating with the airplane. So one of the things that I hope coming out of the Learn to Turn initiative is to borrow a little bit from the military approach, which the military, when they talk about turn performance, and this has been adopted by ICAS and the air show industry as well, they don't care what geometric plane that occurs in, whether it's the vertical or the horizontal or in the oblique. It's all turn performance. And so sort of taking that idea and bringing it back down and talking about This is what the ailerons do, this is what the rudder does, this is what the elevator does, and then this is how you make the music to make the turn happen. And where the errors really accumulate is not in the basic shallow bank turn, but in the steeper turns, or when we start doing more complex maneuvers like chandelles and lazy eights, and where we start to miscommunicate, or the overshoot from base to final, where the pilot hopes that they're trying to improve the turn rate back to the runway, but what in fact they're doing is they are exactly making the inputs you would want to make to enter a spin, but they're not aware that that's the result that's going to happen. So we're hoping to start off slowly and simply, and then allow pilots to go as deeply into the subject as they want to go.
Great. Well, I look forward to seeing more of that as you progress on that project. Mr. Oord, you spoke about your work with the new airman certification standards. And I know that they're with the FAA right now going through different approval process, and there are slated release dates. But at this point in time, is there anything that flight instructors can do in taking the research and the work that you all have done and implement it into their training?
Yes, there is. And so we wanted this process to be transparent, open, and we wanted community feedback. So on behalf of the working group, the FAA published the draft standards in the Federal Register. There's a docket that's available. I can send it to you to be part of this forum's docket and package, where they can review the draft standards. In addition to that, if you go to FAA Airman Testing Training website, AFS 630, they have all of the draft standards there. In addition to the draft standards, they recently released a brochure, trifold, talking about what the Airman Certification Standards are. There's a frequently asked questions section. And then part of the prototyping, which was critical, was that the FAA flight standards evaluated the private pilot standard and the IFR standard that's currently being prototyped, and compared and contrasted that to the current practical test standard, and they match. Everything that's in the PTS is in the ACS. Therefore, they issued a policy memo saying that it could be used for testing, and that has allowed us to prototype the standards. So, having said that, if I was an instructor, I would show from day one, I would give my student the standard, because now here is everything that you will need to know and be able to understand and demonstrate during your practical and your written test. And rather than give him or her a set of FAR aim, a set of guidance, and a set of handbooks and ACs, now it's one package. It's one standard, and then they can know where to go to find the information if they don't understand it or not taught it through their ground school or their instructor. So it's out there, it's available. I'd encourage everybody to go out and see the FAA, again, the Airman Testing and Training website.
Perfect, thank you. And my last question here before turning it over to Member Wehner is for Mr. Poulos. With simulator training, what resources might be available for flight instructors when they're trying to develop loss of control scenarios to do in simulators?
So we've already instituted a number of programs this year that we've done an initial test in the April timeframe of this year, a secondary one during Oshkosh, and a third one we're doing right now that we've called Learn, Do, Fly, which ironically mirrors exactly what Rich was talking about academics and then some simulation, and then actual airplane time. Learn, Do, Fly is learn in webinars and other types of classroom environments. Do is do something in the simulator to reinforce what you learned, and then fly it in a real airplane in the end. Learn, Do, Fly is a website. It's a concept, it's a training methodology, it's something we're creating to try to create that social connecting point for people who are interested in aviation to learn more about where they can go and what they can do to learn more about flying. So that's one of those initiatives that we're doing right now, if I'm accurately answering your question. The other thing, and I said this before about the social aspect of flying, you have to talk to people. And we're trying to create environments for people to be able to talk to each other both in the simulators and away from them. And that's where you get that information about where you can go to learn more about where these better flight schools are, where the better instructors are, where people can learn in a more advanced way.
Great, thank you. Member Weiner?
Thank you. Mr. Stowell, your resume talks about having 33,600 spin entries. And after this past weekend, I presume it's a few more entries. And Mr. Cox has a few more entries too?
Yes, that's true. The more important number, though, is the number of recoveries equals the number of entries.
As long as they're equal, yes. Same thing with takeoffs and landings, right? You talked about the importance of learning to turn. Can you kind of connect that with loss of control, to be explicit? Where does the coordination issue end up causing a loss of control?
Sure. So if we take sort of the mirror image sides of the traffic pattern, perhaps an engine failure on takeoff with an attempted turn back to the runway, or the cross-controlled or skidded turn from base to final. Those typical processes, if we don't really know what the controls are actually doing, are driven sort of like this. The pilot becomes distressed and distracted. Maybe the engine failure, that's a huge distraction. There's a little bit of adrenaline. Performance starts to go down. And so maybe the thought process is, well, if I bank the wings, that takes care of the turn. If I apply back elevator, that takes care of holding the altitude till I'm done with the turn. And of course, that's faulty thinking. That's not going to end the way that the pilot thinks it will. Or in the case of the skidding base to final turn, the pilot may be trying to tighten the turn, and somewhere along the line they may have been admonished never to exceed a certain bank angle in the pattern without any underlying aerodynamic clarification for that in terms of stall speed goes up, and these are some of the reasons why we might not want to do that. So rather than decision-making coming into play and saying, I'll level the wings and go around, the pilot might say, all right, well, the only thing left to me is to apply rudder to try to accelerate the turn, bring the nose back around to the runway. The side effect, if we're in a bank, if we imagine ourselves banked to the left, of adding that left rudder in the direction of the turn is for the nose to start slicing downward through the horizon. The pilot 200 feet above the ground, already a little distracted and stressed, the natural instinct now is to pull back on the elevator to try to get the nose up. And we know the results of that. G goes up, angle of attack goes up, speed goes down, and we meet somewhere at the accelerated stall in a bank in a nose-low attitude. We get to see, unfortunately in some cases, what we only know in theory. We're taught in theory any attitude, any airspeed. Well, here's a perfect example of that. And ultimately, if the airplane does depart controlled flight too close to the ground for any kind of recovery and a stall, and it's labeled as a stall spin accident, but it goes back partly to decision-making, but also partly to not understanding what combination of things are available to me with the controls to do a different type of turn. And so I think trying to help students understand the turn process and become more aware of the interaction of the controls during the turn, I think can go a long way toward making perhaps better decisions about what controls to apply when they're under duress and having to maneuver an airplane.
So a large part of it is uncoordinated flight.
Uncoordinated flight, yes. Coupled with applying aft elevator and pulling it off of a trim set point. It was trimmed for a particular reason in the pattern, but the pilot may be not aware that they're actually pulling it off of the trim set point and increasing angle of attack at the same time.
Thank you, because that's a very complex set of circumstances that all have to come together at the right time at low enough altitude.
Right.
Mr. Turner, I have a question. You talked about standardization on angle of attack, and that some people are calibrating these things while that they're self-calibrating. I should say not self-calibrating. The individuals installing them are calibrating them themselves, perhaps to slightly different conditions. Can you elaborate on that just a bit?
Well, there are, of course, there are really two issues here. The first is the calibration process. Assuming that the pilot is attempting to calibrate the device in the manner in which it's supposed to be calibrated, it's still heavily dependent on the pilot's ability to fly a very precise indicated airspeed that's been calculated for the airplane's particular weight at the time that the calibration is done. I know, for instance, in the case of the Aspen unit, you have to hold your airspeed within, I believe, 3 knots for 2.5 full minutes while you're holding the button down to calibrate it properly. So that itself may be it shouldn't be beyond all pilots, but it may be beyond some, and in certain weather conditions, if you tried to do it in turbulent conditions and you were impatient to calibrate your device, you may get it calibrated improperly and never really know it. So that's one issue. The second is that these are calibrated by the individual pilot flying the individual airplane, and if a particular pilot decides, I really don't want to have this thing calibrated for 1.3 times VSO in the landing configuration to give me this indication, he can choose to calibrate it in some other way. And I know of at least 2 instances where pilots in my particular type club have, for reasons that they feel are significant, have calibrated their angle of attack indicators significantly different than the manufacturer's recommendations. The issue there is what happens when I go fly that airplane. I'm well trained, let's say for instance, I'm well trained and experienced in flying angle of attack using that same manufacturer's device and that same display. I will expect it to have certain performance, I would expect it to give certain indications, and if I fly to the indications I expect but it's calibrated differently, I'm not going to get the result I want. So those are some of my areas of concern about the calibration process with the devices.
And what sort of concerns do you have about training for using angle of attack? Because
Well-
so far we've been promoting the installation of the equipment, but have not really concentrated as much on how it's used.
Well, an analogy might be engine monitored. Now, engine monitors have been adopted widely, at least in certain segments of general aviation, but it's still one of the very most common questions I get when I'm doing flight training with a pilot who may have had that airplane and that monitor for many years is, now how do I use this thing to find the peak EGT? Pilots may be installing a device thinking that the mere installation of the device increases the level of safety, when in fact they really have to learn to use it and use it properly. I don't know, for instance, personally, because I don't have a great deal of experience yet with angle of attack indicators, what is the angle of attack indicator supposed to look like as I turn from base to final if in fact I want it to give me that blue donut or whatever the indication should be on short final with full flaps. So we need to figure out, as an instructional community, we need to figure out not just what short final looks like, but what are the stages that lead up to short final so that we can train pilots to make this transition. And then lastly, because of the calibration issues and the non-standard displays and the non-standard location of the devices even, there is the instructional problem of me teaching you in your airplane when my experience is with a different type of device in another airplane. So an instructor needs to have, it's similar to GPS, you have to have a wide range of experience across a bunch of different makes and models of equipment. So the calibration issue is significant on the training standpoint as well, and then just the wide variety of displays makes for a more significant instructional problem.
So having the hardware, you have the potential for some safety enhancements, but without the training and knowledge of how to use it, you're not there yet.
Exactly, and as David said, the standards are being written to include angle of attack information. The Airplane Flying Handbook is adding a chapter for angle of attack information. I think that eventually, like engine monitors, the angle of attack industry will eventually gel into a more or less standard display that will be easier to teach. Right now, there's just such a wide variety. We'll have to have specialists in the individual types.
Okay, thank you. Question for Mr. Oord. You were heavily involved in the working groups on JSC, loss of control. And one of the major outputs of that activity was the development of safety enhancements. Can you just very briefly, since my yellow light just went on here, say a little bit about how these safety enhancements were identified? You know, was everything just thrown up against the wall and what stuck was what you decided to go with, or was there another process used?
Luckily, no. I will say the dedication of the working group was immense. It was a time-consuming, resource-consuming, all-encompassing process, both the first and the second. Many of the members, I will like to acknowledge, at least raise your hand if you were part of the first or second working group. These people put in countless hours, 3-day meetings throughout the country to do the deep dive into accidents using NTSB data, which was provided to us, full dockets, full pictures, et cetera. We went through 90 accidents in the first working group, 90 in the second working group, line by line, and came up with events for each occurrence, each accident. And then we evaluate what went wrong. So come up with problem statements, and then identify, well, how much did that contribute to this accident? And then come up with interventions that would prevent that problem from occurring in the future. After which, everything is evaluated for feasibility, technological feasibility, financial, et cetera. And you eventually get to an overall effective score. And then you rank everything. Again, this is in the final report, so if anybody wants to look at it, it's all documented, it's all very transparent about how we got to where we got. Once you identify the interventions that had the most potential to prevent accidents from occurring in the future, those would then grouped into a safety enhancement using the process that was championed by CAST. And those safety enhancements identify who's going to do what by when and what kind of resources it will take to do so. Angle of attack was the one that scored the highest as far as overall effective and feasibility score because it was relatively inexpensive. It did not require a big level of certification, and it was relatively, it could be done quicker than any massive change. So we're seeing it being implemented, and I'm happy to see it being implemented. But everything, again, was evaluated using a data-driven process. It's all out there for everybody to see, but I stand behind the work, but now is the time to really implement it to the full extent. We have a GAJSC meeting tomorrow to talk about how we're implementing it. And I think before we move on to the next phase, it's important to really almost double down on loss of control, because if we make a significant dent in loss of control only, we will significantly improve the safety of general aviation.
Great description of quite a disciplined process. Well, that is our time is up. So thank you, Dr. Dunks, for the session. And thanks to all the panelists. This panel has given us some idea of what is and is not effective training as regards to preventing loss of control, and a bit of insight into some of the work being done to get the most out of that training. We'll now take a break until 2:55, when we'll return for the fourth panel of the day, Equipment and Technology Solutions.